Welcome to another episode of A Cuppa with a Conversationalist. My name is Con and I am the Conversationalist. And yes, I have my latte in tow. My caffeine addiction is not getting any better. My guest today is Dr. Tom Nehmy, PhD. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, Con, it's great to be on your show.
Absolute pleasure to have you. Tom is a clinical psychologist with more than 20 years' experience. His passion is preventing psychological problems in people of all ages, whilst also enhancing resilience and well-being. His doctoral research in developing the Healthy Minds program produced the world's first prevention program to prevent the onset of symptoms of depression and anxiety, whilst also reducing risk for eating disorders. He was subsequently awarded the 2015 Flinders University Vice-Chancellor's Prize for Doctoral Thesis Excellence. Tom is a prolific public speaker and corporate trainer across Australia and overseas, and has co-authored 10 scholarly articles in peer-reviewed scientific publications. He is the author of the book, Apples of the Mind, Creating Emotional Balance, Peak Performance and Lifelong Wellbeing. And his work has been featured on Triple J, ABC, Radio 7 News, Power FM, Radio Adelaide, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and The Advertiser, just to mention a few, and now on A Cuppa with a Conversationalist. What a resume.
Well, we're adding to it today, Con. I've been looking forward to this chat.
as am I. Mate, let's just start. Where did your interest in psychology begin, and how did you end up where you are?
My interest in psychology was an absolute plan B.
Oh.
So I didn't want to be a psychologist growing up, didn't really sense that that was going to be my path. I actually wanted to be a professional racing driver. And I devoted all of my energies from kind of early adolescence until I was about 18, 19 years old into trying to make that happen. It clearly didn't work out. And so plan B it was. And the plan B, I made an agreement with my parents, having somehow managed to pull out some reasonably good results in year 12. If you saw my year 11 report card, you wouldn't have been expecting I was going anywhere. But I actually had a pep talk that made a real difference to me in the final years of year 12. I got my head down and got some reasonably good grades, and it meant that I got into a psychology honours degree, but I deferred it. And my parents were concerned, as many parents might think, oh, will he ever go back to it? Will he actually study? And the deal was I had 12 months to try to find sponsorship and make this pipe dream a reality. And if it didn't work out, then university it was. And that's how I ended up studying psychology.
How close did the racing dream come to becoming a reality, just out of interest?
Not close enough. I never won a race. I couldn't attract a sponsor, and I ran out of money. So
Okay.
that's not particularly close. It wasn't for lack of trying or passion, but yeah, it's a pretty expensive game, and I do think it was something I had a modicum of talent for. I think it, when I got in a race car or a sprint cart, I was able to drive it pretty well. But I never had the gear to do it, and I never had the funds to do it. So you're starting behind the eight ball if that's the case.
I was going to say it's certainly a pretty expensive hobby. Um, in mental health as a broad term is something that I'm finding, and I'm much older. In the last 10, 15 years, it seems to become it's more talked about. It's more, there's a higher level of awareness to it. Now, I'm curious to know, is the problem becoming bigger? I.e., are more people being faced with mental health issues, or is it just that we are more aware of it and it is more top of mind?
It's both. So I think we are seeing an increase in prevalence, and there's a few contributing reasons for that. But we also have much greater exposure to the vocabulary, the language around mental ill health, psychological problems. There's fewer barriers to help seeking as well, which is good. People are less likely to stuff it away in their consciousness and not actually realize that they would benefit from reaching out. So the answer is definitely both. And it means that we've got a pretty significant challenge ahead of us in terms of turning that around. So one of the frustrating things for me is that I see these repeated waves of headlines of doom almost, that we see increasing prevalence of anxiety and depression and other problems. And the thing that bothers me about it, it's not that we can't treat these problems when they arise, because for most psychological disorders, there's something that psychologists can do that's very likely to help. It's that we aren't preventing it. And this is my bugbear, is that we can prevent the onset of anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. But on average, across Australia and the world, we don't prevent it. And this is really the guiding light, if you will, behind my work now as a psychologist, as opposed to when I was doing your regular psychological work with, clients on the leather couch and helping them resolve their problems.
Okay. How big is the problem, I guess, in terms of what's it costing business, or what's it costing in terms of human cost? Any feedback on that?
Well, it's not hyperbole to say it's enormous.
Yeah.
It is enormous. That's not an exaggeration. It's enormous because it affects almost half of the population at some point in their life.
Wow.
So
Okay.
if there's 25 million odd people in Australia, or a bit more than that, that's a lot of people who at some point will experience mental ill health. Now, you might say, well, it's normal to encounter difficult times at some point in your life, to have significant stresses and challenges, exposure to traumatic events, perhaps. That happens. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that people should end up with a psychological disorder. When we talk about these statistics, it's not about someone going through a rough time or a bad day, or, it's a prolonged period of significant mood changes and behavioral changes. And, these kind of diagnoses from a clinical standpoint aren't made lightly, because, humans go through difficult things all the time, and it doesn't mean it's a psychological disorder. But the rate of actually people becoming stuck, and it's a word I use quite a lot to describe psychopathology or psychological disorders, it's stuckness. It's not the experience of intense emotion. It's not the experience of distress. It's the continuity of that distress. So we would never diagnose someone with depression based on them feeling, even if they felt extremely down, they would never be diagnosed with depression unless that markedly low mood was persisting for at least a fortnight. So this idea of being stuck, it's not, oh, well, I feel bad today. It's I'm stuck in that state. And this is part of our diagnostic criteria. It's what's the duration of your distress? And so part of being mentally healthy and part of preventing these problems is not about trying to avoid the possibility that people will encounter distress and discomfort. It's that they respond in such a way that they don't get stuck in a state of distress and dysfunction. And so, the fact that the problem is so big, that it is, a multi-billion-dollar cost on our economy, but more importantly, it has a generational impact in terms of quality of life. And, depressed parents are less effective in their parenting. Anxious parents are more likely to model anxious behaviors to their kids. And I'm not saying that to be catastrophic. I'm just saying that's kind of how it propagates.
Yeah.
So we need to be interventionist from a public health level. We need to do things that both treat these problems when they exist and treat them effectively, but we must do more to prevent them. And that's the big opportunity to change these statistics that we hear and read about.
Interesting points there. And I do have a few more questions relating to that in a while. One thing I'm curious about, are we more stressed as a society where we are, or do we have more to be stressed about?
We're potentially more stressed because we don't get the opportunity to switch off. And this is one of the byproducts of this technological age that we live in, is that there are benefits to that technology, but there are also costs.
Mm.
And so one of the things that we do at Healthy Minds is we work a lot with young people. And when I think about my experience of going to school, which was far from a perfect experience, but I knew that if I had a really difficult day at school or I was struggling with something with my peers, that when I went home from school, there was a relative oasis from whatever that stressor was.
Yep.
And I would have my, whatever it would be, 16 hours before I had to go and face that difficult thing at school again. My concern is that for young people today, they don't have that mechanism of switching off, because if they are on social media, if they do have devices, there's texting, there's messaging, there's all sorts. There's this kind of pressure to be linked into so much of what's going on. And so we don't get to switch off from it. And many adults are like that. We know that heavy social media users often engage in this almost subconscious comparison with what they're seeing all the time. So if someone's spending however long scrolling through Facebook or whatever else, they even, psychiatrists coined the term Facebook depression because of this continual comparison. And I think that's a big part of this idea of modern stress. The other thing, though, Con, that I think is really important to talk about is we are not necessarily increasing our capacity to handle stress. And I see this through a generational shift in parenting practices. So we, one of the things we can see on average is a generational shift in how parents raise their kids. So this isn't true for every parent of every generation, but on average. Yeah. And so, you might say that of my grandparents' generation, who are, most of whom are passed away now, there's maybe this sense that they were quite detached or not emotionally attuned to their kids. Then we look at parenting of today's parents, parents of young kids, and we see almost an over-involvement in many respects. And we sometimes call this over-parenting, where parents end up doing too much for their kids. And it actually gets in the way of a really crucial process, which is for young people to face age-appropriate, mild to moderate stresses. And if my mum never makes me confront the teacher when I didn't do my homework, or I never have to go on school camp, or I get the note that says I don't have to give the talk in class, it's denying me all these opportunities to learn to habituate to difficult and stressful things, to realize I can face it, feel nervous, learn to adapt, calm down, or test this hypothesis that I can't do it or it's terrible. And so, this myth in mental health is like, oh, well, we've got to help people feel calm. I've never heard such crap in my life. Calm is not an indicator of being mentally healthy. This idea that we've just got to, almost create a emotional utopia for young people of where stress is harmful. Stress is not inherently harmful. Moderate stress makes us more focused and we perform better. So we need to change the way we relate to stress and relate to discomfort.
There is absolutely no doubt, and personal experience, the way that my grandparents were, the way that my parents were, the way that I was as a parent, and now watching my kids as parents. And it's definitely, I won't say in our situation it's over-parenting, but it's definitely being overprotective and not allowing them to deal with certain situations that are healthy and you need to experience. With the social media, and this is something that I've always spoken about with my kids as well. When I was at school, as you said before, if there was a challenge, you went home and it was safe. There was only the telephone, which was on the wall with the dial tone, for those old enough to remember. it wasn't this constant barrage of 24/7, whether it's Facebook, Messenger, whatever else. What advice would you, well, for kids that are just feeling so intensely pressured to be a part of that? How can either parents help them, or how can they help themselves to detach?
It's to realize that participation in that is optional. It's not actually compulsory. Now, it's perceived as compulsory because what am I going to miss out on? Or, this fear of missing out, right?
FOMO, yeah.
But it's not compulsory. And so at the very least, for a young person, they might say, well, I don't want to not be connected at all in this way. But what they can do is limit their time spent engaged in those online activities. And this is actually really what the research is suggesting. There was a large study in North America that tracked the well-being of young people when had been running for many, many years. And what they observed is that there was gradual increase in well-being over time. And then it dropped off and there was a marked decrease, and the trend started to reverse. Well, the year that it all changed was the year that smartphone ownership became commonplace amongst teenagers. Mm. So, and the authors of this study went to great lengths to say, we're not saying the technology is evil. We're not saying it's inherently bad. What we're saying is a little bit of connectedness through the technology is associated with high levels of well-being. But it was when the engagement with the device and the social media took young people away from non-screen related activities, like seeing your friends in person, exercising, walking the dog, going on a date, whatever else might be that we would do in the real world. When it took young people away from that, that's when it was associated with reduced well-being.
And are you seeing that affecting adults as well?
Well, we're seeing some of these overparented kids are now in early adulthood. And when I work with corporate clients doing workshops and training, they often will report to me that they observe a generational shift in, the buzzword is resilience, right? They don't seem to be able to cope as well with stresses. They give up too easily. They don't have realistic expectations. So we're already seeing that in young adults. But the takeaway message here is, and particularly for parents who are overparenting, is we can't expect a young person to become resilient without the opportunity to be resilient. So if you're never giving the talk in class, if you're never going on school camp, if you're never getting dragged to school when you're trying to skive off and stay home and you don't really have the tummy ache, those experiences are crucial because they help kids learn how to deal with difficult things. And you and I know, Con, in the real world, in the adult world, there are difficult things.
Oh, yes.
So all we're doing is denying the opportunity to learn to cope with reality.
Yeah. I hate the C word, but it would be remiss of me not to bring it up, particularly when I'm speaking to somebody of your expertise. It's well documented the effect of that COVID had on people's mental health, particularly the lockdowns and the disconnection and the lack of human interaction, which we know as humans we crave. There's the famous parable of the Chinese farmer, which says one of his horses ran away, and the villagers came and said, "Oh my God, you've lost your horse. That must be bad." And he's going, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back and brought back 20 wild horses. That's fantastic. Yeah. Next day, his son went to break one of the horses in and broke his leg. Oh, that must be bad. Next day, the army came along. They were in a war and they were conscripting all the young people. And of course, they couldn't take his son because he had a broken leg. Oh, wasn't that lucky? Anyway, my point being, what good, if any, came out of COVID from a mental health perspective?
He taught people to invest proactively in their own well-being. Because when you go into a situation like that, you rely on the capital that you've built up. You rely on your personal resources. You rely on your own fortitude and psychological skills. Your baseline level of well-being going into that situation is a significant predictor of how well you're going to cope with it. So it taught us that we can't just cruise along in life without being proactive to build. I use the analogy of a boat. If you've got really good conditions, sun's out, light breeze, no waves, any boat will do. But when conditions get tough, you rely on the boat that you've built, and you need a bloody good one then. So people's baseline level of well-being, their baseline level of psychological skills, their pre-existing resilience, if you like, was a significant predictor for how well you would cope with it. So that's the big lesson from all of this is preventive psychology is not sexy, but it's very important. And, we're so attuned in mental health to being firefighters. We respond to the crisis. We reach out for help when the house is on fire and it's urgent, right? I've all my time in private practice, I would get these calls. But in preventive psychology, what we're doing is saying, well, what if we stop your house from catching fire in the first place? Now, that's not sexy. People don't celebrate your house not catching fire.
Yeah.
They celebrate you saving the day. And so preventive psychology is very much a quiet achievement. But this is one of the big lessons. And all the lockdowns of COVID and certainly in parts of Australia, South Australia, we didn't do it as tough as people say in Victoria, for example. But what extended lockdowns did is they mimicked depressive behavior. So if you think about someone who is depressed, they are inclined to be withdrawn and inactive. This is the inertia of low mood and low energy. It becomes, we call it the vicious cycle of depression. When you feel down, you have the urge to withdraw, pull up the covers, don't go to work, don't see anyone. But being withdrawn and inactive, eventually, that might comfort you in the short term, but eventually that's depressing.
Yeah.
To be withdrawn and inactive. And then it feeds into itself. So it's literally referred to as a vicious cycle. And really what lockdowns did for people was it mimicked depressive behavior. They were, in effect, they were forced to be withdrawn and inactive. For periods of time, people weren't allowed to go out and exercise and things like that. So it's quite an odd sort of experiment in a way to see how that affected people. And probably there are people in parts of the world definitely still affected by that. But the lesson is don't rely on just the vagaries of your life to determine whether or not you have the resources to deal with a difficult time. Invest in it now, and you can invest in it. There's a lot we can do to build that robust boat, to have the tank of resources we need. And it doesn't mean we're going to just sail through it easily, but it means we can cope much better.
There's two aspects to that. There's the corporate side and the personal side. From a corporate perspective, I know you do a lot of work in the corporate sector and with organisations. You make the point of the fighting the fire is a sexy part. Preventing the fire is not so sexy. How have you been able to, or how proactive is, let's say, corporate Australia in investing and being proactive rather than reactive? And is there a trend that you see there?
Yes, it's definitely increasing. Corporate Australia is much more aware of the benefits of being proactive. They're becoming increasingly mindful of the costs of mental ill health. Legislative changes around things like psychosocial hazards means that there's a greater spotlight on them needing to address certain risks in the workplace. But one of the things that most quickly changes the mind of corporate leaders, if they weren't already attuned to this, the thing that changes their mind most quickly is when we spell out the link between well-being and work performance. Because if you're a hard-nosed, numbers-driven executive and you see workplace well-being as a fluffy extra that, oh yeah, I guess we should do that, or we should be seen to doing that.
Yeah.
But then you realize the direct link between well-being and absenteeism and productivity and all of those other things that the hard-nosed executive is going to be interested in. Then it's a different story. All of a sudden, whether you see it through a humanitarian lens, oh, it's the right thing to do for people, or you see it through an accounting lens, literally, how is it going to affect our profitability? All roads lead towards needing to be proactive. So we're definitely seeing corporate Australia tune into this.
Yeah, as they should. Being a cynic that I am sometimes, I do see larger organisations, and I'm certainly not going to mention any here for fear of being sued, but people who I know quite well work in particular organisations, and I'm talking big organisations who are continually spruiking how proactive they are in people's mental health and things like that. And some of the work conditions are appalling, to say the least. Like, some of the call centres in particular, how much pressure they're under to resolve a client's issue or something like in 3 minutes. And then they get warnings. And it's like, yes, we're proactive, but nah, I don't think so. And that's the thing from my perspective that I get really, really cynical about.
There are big organizations out there doing it well and trying to do it well. And there are organizations out there who might be well-intentioned, but if the structure of the job and the nature of the work is pathogenic, that is, it causes psychopathology, then no amount of training or workshops or whatever is actually going to fix that. And there have been instances where, in a roundabout way, I've been keen not to work with particular organisations because you don't want to be the scapegoat. Oh, well, this is going to fix all our problems, and yet structurally there's a problem. If there's a structural problem with the work and it's causing psychopathology, then I can't fix that.
I'd like to chat about your doctoral research because I'm fascinated, certainly with the what you wrote, the prevention program, prevention onset of symptoms of depression, anxiety, whilst also reducing the risk of eating disorders. Can you share a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, I felt like I was at a very fortunate moment in time because I was living my life as I'm going to say, regular clinical psychologist, and I don't want to be disparaging of my peers, but I was doing the usual stuff. I was a therapist. I realized that I had a pretty good toolkit that I would teach people, a toolkit of skills that a lot of people resonated with, and it helped them improve their mental health. I also observed that people, when they arrive at therapy, are not in the best position to learn sophisticated new skills. And the baseline level of knowledge about what good mental health looks like and where it comes from was really low. These were some observations I made. And I was sitting with a client one day who was in some distress, which was not uncommon when they first arrived. And I had this thought pop into my head, which was, what would have happened for this person if they already knew the skills you're about to teach them? Could we have prevented this? And I didn't have a good answer for it, but it got me thinking then. It started intruding on my consciousness, this thought, could we have prevented this? Could we have prevented this? And I got to thinking about other areas of healthcare where prevention is a main focus. So dentistry, preventive dentistry is a major thing. We brush our teeth twice a day because it's a preventive strategy. and it's accepted, and the benefits of toothbrushing are well documented and significant. Well, what is the psychological equivalent of brushing your teeth? And this is what nobody knew and nobody had. We weren't doing this. Just even the phrase preventive psychology, if you Googled it, there'd be like one hit. Like nobody was doing it or talking about it. And this really was the thing that led me down this research path. I ended up scaling back my private practice. I spent 4 years as a full-time student, research student at Flinders Uni in the School of Psychology. And the fortuitous moment for me was that as I started this research, there was a very important theoretical development in psychology. And now, to put some context in it, we've got a lot of research evidence to say we can treat disorders, but the evidence to say we could prevent them was woeful, absolutely woeful. There was no gold standard. Most of the time that people tried prevention programs, they didn't do anything. Occasionally they caused harm. There was no clear evidence for how to prevent the onset of these disorders. But the theoretical shift was something called transdiagnostic theory. And transdiagnostic theory says psychological problems have more in common than you think. They tend to overlap. And so trans meaning across and between diagnoses. What are the things that operate across and between multiple psychological diagnoses? And this was like a light going off in my head, because as a clinician, we know that's true. As a clinician, it would be really weird to have somebody with depression who also had no symptoms of anxiety. That would be weird. And it would be weird to have someone with bulimia who had no symptoms of depression. We call this comorbidity, and it's really normal. And it suggests to us that, okay, we can categorize things as being discrete and separate, but they're not really. There's these underlying mechanisms in our emotional lives, in our psychology, that says it's much messier than that. You can have your separate categories, but in real life, these things overlap. So what are the shared mechanisms? That was the question. And so in creating the Healthy Minds program that we tested at Flinders, it was asking really three questions. What is a main risk factor that operates across anxiety, depression, and eating disorders? What is a major protective factor that operates across anxiety, depression, and eating disorders? And what are the broad skills that we need to have a healthy mind that's likely to help us manage our emotions across these different conditions? Because psychological disorders are just different manifestations of people getting stuck in unhelpful coping strategies. That's one way of thinking about it. So I was able to put together a toolkit. We tested it. Do you want to know what the risk factor was?
Yeah.
It was something called unhelpful perfectionism. It's sometimes called clinical perfectionism, and it's a rigid, relentless striving to meet unrealistic standards. And it's a risk factor for anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicidality, outcomes of therapy, a whole range of things. This was the transdiagnostic risk factor. And even if you're not a perfectionist, you may still have some of the qualities of a perfectionist. So these are things like black and white thinking, self-criticism in your self-talk, social comparison, avoidant coping, low distress tolerance. These are all things that we notice in people who have high levels of perfectionism. But even if you took that label away from it, those components of perfectionism are endemic to all those disorders. So this was a massive clue. This was a set of clues. If we could create the antidote to those problematic things, then we're giving people a toolkit that plugs all of those holes. And that was effectively the thinking that led to this. Well, in a way, it was a breakthrough, because we demonstrated we can prevent the onset of anxiety symptom, depression symptoms, and reduce risk for eating disorders without talking about these disorders. We just did it by teaching skills.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's yeah, perfectionism. I think there's a bit of perfectionism in most people, and social media is certainly not helping that as well. Um, One thing that I really, really was fascinated about when I heard you speak recently, you spoke about self-esteem versus self-compassion. Tell us about that.
There was a point in time at which more scientific articles in psychology had been written about self esteem than any other topic. It became this presumed panacea for all manner of psychological problems. There was a view within parenting and within education and within society as a whole that said a person's self-esteem, how favorably they evaluate themselves, was going to be the magic bullet to stop them from being depressed or anxious. And it led to things like um, unremitting praise, regardless of somebody's performance. Um, you know, um, a marked reduction in assessment and evaluation. And this still is a legacy that's occurring today, where we give kids far fewer tests and assessment tasks because they're, one of the reasons, there's probably other reasons, but one of the reasons is, oh, but we don't want to have kids feel that they're not doing as well as someone else. And it's all predicated on this idea. If you praise someone, if you give them lots of positive feedback, they're going to feel so good about themselves that they won't get anxious or depressed. Well, it didn't work. And we know it didn't work because throughout the height of the self-esteem movement, rates of anxiety and depression increased. And we now know self-esteem is moderately correlated with narcissism. So you can even feel too good about yourself. Um, Self-compassion is a much more recent development, although it is based on ancient Buddhist teachings, and as a concept, it has been out there for a long time. But in mainstream psychology, it's relatively recent. And Professor Kristen Neff, who was at, I think it was a university in Texas for a period of time, she's really the leading light in this area of self-compassion. And she says, well, self-compassion um, isn't so much about what happens to you. Did you do well or not? It's how do you treat yourself when you go through a difficult time? She would say, are you an inner ally or are you an inner enemy? And so self-compassion is not about how good you feel about it. It's how do you treat yourself. And so that's a very, very important distinction. So self-esteem didn't end up being all it's cracked up to be, but self-compassion is. And our research at Flinders was the first large study in Australia to measure self-compassion in young people. Well, we found those who were higher on self-compassion, that is when they made a mistake or they had a really bad day, or they were going through painful emotions, they didn't beat themselves up. They just treated themselves with more acceptance and kindness and forgiveness and encouragement. And for those young people who were higher with that self-compassion, on average, they were significantly lower on anxiety, depression, and body image concerns. So this became the transdiagnostic protective factor that I was looking for. And it's certainly one of the things in all of our work, and the many tens of thousands of people who have come to our workshops. Self-compassion is one of the things that people often say, gee, that I can see this could change my life. This is something that's going to really make a difference for me.
Certainly had me thinking when I heard it from you at that talk, because again, part of what I do through my public speaking and coaching and training is promoting self-esteem, not certainly to the point of narcissism, but for people to have a level of confidence about themselves. But self-compassion, I just really, really sort of hit a spot with me. I know personally some of the things that we think and say about ourselves, we wouldn't think or say to our worst enemy. So it's about being compassionate.
It's so true. I had someone in one of my workshops, a corporate leader, said to me, if I spoke to my friends the way I speak to myself, I wouldn't have any friends.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. It's crazy. Yet we do it. Um, I, something that I hadn't written down as a question, but it's stuck in there now after our last conversation. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about the prevalence of participation awards. So, in other words, everybody gets a medal, as opposed to the original belief of you get rewarded for success. Let's say.
I'm going to give you a perhaps seemingly contradictory answer. I think it's really important that we reward effort more than outcome when kids are young, because that's one of the ways we can undermine the development of unhelpful perfectionism. We don't want it to all be about the grade and the result and the end point, because if it becomes, I fear that if young kids go through self-evaluative processes all the time, am I good enough? Did I reach the grade? They can almost train themselves to have their self-worth all based in that. We know people will perform better through more attempts, through having a go at things. This is where capability comes from. It's not from going to play golf and being good at golf the first time. It's from playing again and again and again and again and again. So if people are too tied up in, did I do well? How well did I do? Then it's very easy for them to give up or be demoralized. We want them to focus on the learning. And so we want to reward effort over outcome. What did I learn? Not so much how did I do. But the other side of that argument is we mustn't protect kids from seeing the end results of their effort, because in the real world, they will encounter assessment and grading and competitive processes. So I'm going to say, it's going to sound like I'm sitting on the fence, but I'm saying we need kids to be exposed to the reality of results and outcomes. But at the same time, if we can foster their effort and reward them for their effort so that they persist and try lots of things without being obsessive about the outcome all the time, then that's, for me, the perfect marriage.
Okay. I like that. I want to refer to your book there, which we're going to put, I can't see it very well. There we go. That's better. For our listeners and viewers, Dr. Tom Nehmy, Apples for the Mind, Creating Emotional Balance, Peak Performance, and Lifelong Wellbeing. One of the things in chapter 7, Tom, you talk about anxiety can turn into calm and confidence. Anxiety is the most common psychological problem there is. It disrupts people's personal and professional lives and saps their ability to function well. Instead of being able to enjoy the here and now, sufferers are continually distracted by the next, in brackets, potential disaster. Yet anxiety grows out of a very healthy and natural emotion that we absolutely would not want to get rid of, and that's fear. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Every emotion has a gift and a trap. And we label emotions that are uncomfortable or unpleasant negative emotions. But I think in a way that's a misnomer, because no emotion is bad and we don't want to get rid of them. They are functional. So if you understand the function of emotions, we don't need to be intimidated by them. So the gift of fear is that it is our safety-seeking instinct. If you're actually in danger and you have the house on fire or the out-of-control car coming at you or whatever it is, then fear is your friend, because it activates your adrenal system, it mobilizes your body, and it gives you an urge to take action. That's very adaptive. And if we didn't have that as a species, we'd be extinct. So we don't want to get rid of fear. The trap of fear is when we avoid things that are safe but challenging. And so this is the key way of teasing out, when do I need to run away or when do I need to face it? Well, the question is this a threat or is this a challenge? And our brains will give us an adrenal response. Our brains are brilliant, but they're not perfect. So your brain will trigger some adrenaline in you, which will cause your heart rate to increase, your respiration to increase. Blood will move from your digestive tract to your arms and your legs, which will cause butterflies in the tummy. Your pupils will dilate. You might even get a dry mouth. And this can happen very, very, very quickly. And that can happen just from something that is uncomfortable and challenging, not something that actually puts you in danger. So, for your listeners, if you think about a time, if anyone can think about a time where they definitely had an adrenal response, so they noticed those physiological things, the butterflies in the tummy, the heart rate, all of that, but the situation was safe. That's an example of where we can get led astray if we avoid those things. So, think about the job interview. You can have the butterflies in the tummy. You can definitely feel a bit of that anxious response, that adrenal response. But it doesn't mean you're going to die. You're not going to die in your job interview. And yet evolution says, oh, maybe this is dangerous. Our brains aren't brilliant at delineating that because half our brain systems are primal. And they weren't job interviews where that part of the brain was developed, right?
No, you're
There
avoiding
were things you needed.
dinosaurs.
Exactly. There were still things you needed to run away from, but it wasn't a job interview. So that's really the question. Is it a threat or is it a challenge?
Mm.
And if it's a challenge, and if people habitually avoid or escape from challenges just because they want to feel calm, they are denying themselves the opportunity to overcome those fears. And if we face that fear repeatedly, if you give the presentation, a lot of people terrified by public speaking.
Yeah, yeah.
If you give the talk and you feel nervous and it goes okay and you get through it, and then you do it again, 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 and then you do it again. Well, on the 10th or 20th time, you're not going to have the same level of adrenal response. And eventually you might even give a talk and you think, actually, I don't feel anxious at all. Now, that's an example of how we overcome these fears. So, fear is a gift. If you're in danger, it helps us to run away, but it's going to be a trap for you if you see things that are challenging as dangerous when they're just challenges. And we need to step into those things.
Mm. I'm really curious because you mentioned about public speaking, and they jokingly say more people fear public speaking than death. And one of the things that I've learned in my journey is a strategy called reframe. So instead of, we tell ourselves that we're scared of something, which creates the response, the fear response, as opposed to I'm scared of doing this, I'm excited for the opportunity. Is that something that you think actually works and is realistic or not?
Well, I think that specific example can work because the physiology of excitement is almost identical to the physiology of fear. They both involve an adrenal response, right? So yeah, I think that kind of reframe can be helpful because if we use emotional reasoning, so if we say, well, I feel anxious, therefore I'm in danger, therefore something terrible might happen, that's unhelpful. That kind of escalates it. And if you have anxious thoughts when you feel anxious, what does it do to your adrenaline? It increases
Yeah,
it.
of course. Yeah.
And then your physiology increases. Oh, my heart's racing even more than it was before. Something must be wrong. And then that thought, something must be wrong, releases more adrenaline. And this is where panic comes from. So it's just a very clear and understandable physiological and cognitive cycle. It's what am I telling my brain? What am I saying to myself? And what's that doing to my physiology? So I think a reframe can work really well.
Mm. One of the other things that we hear a lot about is choice. And one of the things that people, well, certainly friends and family, are in a situation and they feel stressed or there's a level of anxiety, they're going through a particular issue. And the language is, I can't help feeling. In other words, they're literally depriving themselves of choice. How important is that in dealing with depression and anxiety?
Yeah, it is an important distinction because while we do operate on what I'm going to call automatic pilot a lot of the time. A lot of our thinking is in this mode of automatic processing. We're not consciously aware of the thoughts we're having. We're not consciously weighing up every option when we make a decision. And that's very important, because if we were consciously aware of every piece of information, then we'd be exhausted in 5 minutes. But it's not true that we don't have choice. There are very rare. I pose the question to my audiences all the time: do your emotions control your behavior? And often a lot of people will say, yes, emotions control my behavior. Some people will say no. A lot of people kind of say, well, they don't have to. You don't have to let them. It's only if you let them. They'll say things like that. And my response is that emotions don't control our behavior. Our choices do, with rare exceptions. So I always put an asterisk on the screen.
The caveat.
And I say, well, there is some fine print. Okay, so occasionally emotions cause your behavior, and that is true, but it's very rare. It's when it's purely instinctive. So if you're, I use the example, if you're driving a car at night and something runs out in front of your car right at the last minute, well, your amygdala, the emotional center in your brain, will send a signal to your foot to slam on the brake pedal, and it will be so fast you won't have a choice in it. So we could say, okay, that's an emotion causing a behavior. But most of the time, we have a choice. We can feel angry but speak calmly. We can feel nervous but give the talk that we have to give. We can wake up and feel like we just want to pull up the covers over our head, but we can get up and go to work because we have to. And this ability, this choice, this ability to override our emotional urges is crucial, because what would the world look like if everyone went with their feelings all the time?
Yeah. True. Tom, we could chat for days, but we won't. I'm curious, just for the audience, just some free consult. What are some of, given, I guess, what we're going through in society, some of the things that we've spoken about, and some of the things that you're certainly aware of, what are some simple strategies, maybe your top 3 that our audience can employ to either control or lower their levels of stress or anxiety?
Be courageous, not perfect.
I love that.
Participation and learning from experience, having a go at things, and being comfortable with discomfort is utterly liberating. People achieve more, they cope with more, they do more, they learn more, if they don't wait for conditions to be perfect before they take action. The second one is throw positive thinking in the bin and go with healthy thinking. And healthy thinking meets 3 criteria. It should be balanced, it should be helpful to you, and it should be realistic. And if your thinking is balanced, helpful, and realistic, that's healthy. The reason, and I'm always kind of grabbing a little bit of a response when I say throw positive thinking in the bin. I'm not saying don't be a positive person. I'm not saying don't have a positive attitude. But if our strategy is just to think positive thoughts, that's neither balanced, it's not always helpful, and it's certainly not realistic. So it violates the criteria of healthy thinking, in my opinion. And the third piece of advice I would give to people is to treat themselves kindly.
Yeah, I love that one. Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. My guest today has been Dr. Tom Nehmy, PhD and author of Apples for the Mind. We'll get it in the screen here. We'll have the link in the show notes where you can get a copy. And I've started reading it. I'm into chapter 3, and it certainly got my attention. And I'll make sure that any links are in the show notes as well to Dr. Tom's work, programs, etc. Again, Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Con. That was great to be with you.
Thank you so much. My guest today has been Dr. Tom Nehmy, PhD, clinical psychologist. My name is Con. I am the Conversationalist. And until next time, bye for now.